I'd like to consider myself a competent person. I'm kind of a jack of all trades, I love learning new things, and I'm pretty sure I could tackle any challenge with the right combination of knowledge, logic, and grit. So a few years ago, when my attempt to make it in London failed miserably, forcing me to move back to Pittsburgh to live with my mother and stepfather, it was a huge blow to my pride. To make matters worse, my mother had moved out of the city into this old farmhouse on 39 acres of woodland. I'm at my best when I have something to focus on, but there I was, marooned in the wilderness, jobless, goalless, and very bored. However, I have always been drawn to water, so there was one saving grace: the pond. A few months earlier, when my mother told me my stepfather was building a pond, I had pictured in my mind a little kidney-shaped thing with some potted plants, maybe a fountain. But when I pulled up the driveway my first day back home, this was a half-acre wide, 11-foot deep mini lake, complete with cattails, lily pads, lotuses, and, I kid you not, a waterfall. It was epic. There was just one thing missing: fish. One day, a truck pulled up the driveway and offloaded 25 boxes. Inside of each was a bag of water containing one Japanese koi fish. They were orange and white, silver and gold, blue and red. One by one, we released them into the pond, and almost instantly, I was in love with them. I had no idea you could become so obsessed with fish. I had never found fish particularly very interesting, and weren't koi just silly, overgrown goldfish? But I discovered they weren't just beautiful, they were intelligent. We went down every day to feed them, and they came to recognize our reflections, and they would bubble up to the surface to greet us. Not only that, but they had different personalities. I know, right? A fish with a personality, but some were timid and docile, others were curious and friendly. So one day, while we were feeding them, I got a great idea. Let's give them all names. And by the time we ran out of fish food, we had named each of them. Excalibur was shiny silver, Sherbet was orange and cream, Pickle looked like a gherkin, and Skeletor had an uncanny black and white pattern. And then there was my personal favorite, Miss Japan. Now, it's hard to tell the sex of a fish, so Miss Japan may have been a mister. But she was solid white with a perfect red spot, like the Japanese flag, and she was my favorite because she wasn't like the other fish. She was bad at swimming. And I've always been one for the underdog, and given my current predicament in life, I kind of identified with her. You know, she was always bumping into things. She would try so hard to get some food, but she'd miss. And she was always the last fish to show up to feeding times. So when she didn't show up one day, I wasn't too concerned. But then we spotted her, laying across the pond, in the cattails, a massive puncture wound through her head. This was no accident. Miss Japan had been murdered. But who or what would do such a thing? It didn't take long to find out who the culprit was. We spotted him later that evening, standing in the shallows, a murderous glint in his eye, a 4-foot-tall great blue heron. The fish were easy prey. We have to do something, I said. They're not just fish. They're our pets. They have names now. My mother and stepfather nodded in agreement. The heron had to be stopped, and just like that, after months of drifting, I had a mission to save our fish. And I attacked the challenge like I would any other, with objective analysis of the facts. I first learned that herons are a territorial species. Thus, logic would indicate if they saw another heron at the pond, they'd just fly on by. So I went out, got a heron decoy, set it up, and the next day I looked out, and there was the heron decoy, and there was the heron? And he looked a little excited to see the decoy. I missed the part about not putting it up during mating season. But that's okay, I did some more research, and I learned that herons are a protected species. You can't hurt them. Not that I was considering such a thing. But they also don't have any natural predators in Pennsylvania, except for one, the great horned owl, obviously. I was skeptical of this claim, but figured whatever, let's get the owl decoys. And I also picked up some of these floating alligator decoys. I figured, who knows, maybe the alligator is from Florida originally. Put them up all over the pond, and they did a great job of chasing away the rest of the wildlife, but the heron was unimpressed. We put up a scarecrow. The heron strolled on by. I wrapped the perimeter of the pond in fishing line. The heron just jumped over it. And the pond had become a battleground and source of constant anxiety. I wasn't sleeping. I read that herons preferred to hunt at dusk and dawn, so I was waking up at 5 a.m. for heron watch. And when I saw him, I'd yell, "Heron alert!" and go running out in my pajamas, banging pots and pans, trying to chase away that big, stupid bird. But he would just fly up into a tree and watch me like, "That's okay, human. I can wait." We're hemorrhaging fish. They were now skittish and fearful, and worst of all was that the heron didn't always eat them. Sometimes he just stabbed them to death and left them floating for us to find later. We had already buried Sharky, Goldie, and Harry Potter in the woods. And then it occurred to me, we're trying to keep the heron out of the pond, but what we need to do is keep the fish out of the shallow areas where the heron likes to hunt. I got some mesh garden fencing and wrapped it around the inner perimeter of the pond where the water started to get deep, and I went to bed that night feeling pretty confident I had found a solution. But the next morning I looked out and there was something circling overhead. And I watched as it dive-bombed directly into the center of the pond and emerged moments later carrying our largest fish, She-Man. It was an osprey. You've got to be kidding me. I took off running after it, waving my arms in the air. I could see She-Man's tail hanging lifelessly in the wind, but there was nothing I could do. I just watched helplessly as he flew off. But when I got back up to the house, I had a new plan. We're going to need a gigantic net. No, my mother said. Listen, if we had put any old fish in that pond, we'd be watching this in awe. But we put those fish where they don't belong, and would you look at what we've done to the pond? I looked at it. She was right. We couldn't protect them. I went down and removed the fishing line and the mesh fencing and the scarecrow and the heron decoys and the owl decoys and the alligator decoys and returned the pond to its natural state. Today, only 5 of the original koi still remain. However, each year they spawn, and a new generation replaces the old. The heron and the osprey still eat them. I've come to terms with the role the fish play in the larger circle of life, and I've learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, in life and in nature, success comes from knowing when to let go. Thank you.